The highest income people in our society get a lot of attention. They're often at the heart of debates about inequalities, and they're very important from a fiscal point of view as well, in that they provide a lot of the tax revenue that we use to fund our public services and our welfare system. But because of data limitations, our understanding of who this group are and what they look like is a little patchy. And so here in this work, we use recently available data from income tax records to try to increase our understanding of what this group look like. The gap between the top 1% and everyone else is certainly far larger than it was a few decades ago. Starting in the 1980s, there was a very well-known increase in income inequality, and during that period, the middle pulled away from the bottom, the top pulled away from the middle, and the very top, the top 1% or so, pulled further and further away from everyone else. Interestingly, after the 1980s, in the period up until the financial crisis of 2008, inequalities in general were much, much more stable. But the top 1% were an exception. That very top group continued to pull further and further away from everyone else right up until around 2008. How much income do you need today to be in the top 1% in the UK? Well, to be in the top 1% of all adults, that's about the top 500,000 adults, you'd need an income of at least £120,000 before tax. Now, in this research, we're using data from income tax records, so that only includes people who are paying income tax. That means it's only including just over half of all adults. So to be in the top 1% of all income taxpayers, that's about the top 300,000 adults in the UK, you need a taxable income of about £160,000 a year or more. But even if you're towards the bottom of that top 1% on around about £160,000 per year, you still have far, far less income than people only a little bit above you. For example, to get into the top 0.1%, you'd need an additional £500,000 a year or so. That top 0.1% starts at about £650,000 per year. So the degree of inequality within that very top chunk of the population is really staggering. The top 1% are certainly not a representative sample of the UK population. We know that some groups tend to earn more than others, and we see that very starkly when we look at who makes it into that top 1% slice. So it's a group that is overwhelmingly male and is disproportionately drawn from London and the South East. And that geographic concentration has actually increased a little bit over time as well. So if we look back to the turn of the century, about 29% of the top 1% lived in London. That's now risen to 35%. Where do the top 1% get their money from? Well, most comes from employment, but actually less of it comes from employment than is the case for people a little further down the income scale. What we do see within the top 1% is a quite important role for business income. In particular, about a quarter of income for the top 1% comes from either dividend income or partnership income. So that's, for example, people working as partners in law firms or as GPs or in hedge funds. One notable aspect of that is that we have made a policy choice in this country to tax income from businesses more lightly than we tax income from a normal employment relationship. And so actually that policy choice is effectively giving a tax break to quite a few people within that top 1% group. One other thing to bear in mind here is that the top 1% are not an unchanging, completely stable group of people. So if you take the top 1% in any particular year, about a quarter of that group will not be in the top 1% the following year, and about half of them will not be in the top 1% 5 years later.